My millionaire parents kicked me out at 19 for being a failure. 18 years later, I'm a Cambridge professor. And I donated the $2 million from their company for scholarships, humiliating them in front of the entire academic community. I'm 37 years old. I'm a professor of environmental chemistry at Cambridge. And 2 weeks ago, I lived through one of the most surreal moments of my life at a gala, where I basically came face to face with the ghosts of my past. And when I say ghosts, I literally mean my parents, whom I hadn't seen in 18 years, since they kicked me out of the house at 19 because, you know, I didn't meet their expectations of what a perfect Morgan family daughter should be. I guess I should start at the beginning, or like, how I got to that breaking point when I was 19. The thing is, my childhood was complicated, let's say. My father, Mr. Morgan, owned Mosaic, a pretty big fertilizer company, and my mother was what people would call a socialite, always busy with her charity events and her whatever clubs. We lived in one of those huge houses where everything had to look perfect from the outside. You know what I mean? But inside it was like living in a museum where you couldn't touch anything, where every move you made was judged and weighed against some impossible standard that nobody ever explained clearly to you. When I got to high school, like at 15 or 16 years old, I started sinking. I don't know exactly when it began, honestly. But suddenly I found myself in this black hole where I couldn't concentrate on anything, where getting out of bed each morning felt like climbing Everest. And my grades, which used to be decent, started plummeting. And my parents, instead of asking what was wrong with me or like showing any genuine concern, they just saw the numbers on the report cards and got more and more disappointed. My father would say things like, "With these results, you're not going to get anywhere, Rebecca." And my mother just looked at me with that cold expression she had, like I was a complete stranger who had deeply disappointed the family. The worst part was when the college acceptance letters came, or rather, the lack of them. I applied to like 10 universities, all those prestigious schools my parents expected, and one by one they rejected me. The only one that accepted me was the local community college, and when I showed my parents that letter, I literally saw something break in my father's eyes. He stared at the paper like I'd handed him a death sentence. And then he looked at me and said, "This is unacceptable." My mother didn't even say anything. She just left the room. Like 2 tense weeks passed where they basically didn't talk to me, and I kept living in that huge house feeling smaller and smaller, more invisible. And then one night, I think it was a Friday. I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember it was Friday because I had planned to go out with a friend. My father called me to his study. I went in and he was sitting behind that massive mahogany desk he had, and without even looking directly at me, he said, "We've decided it's better if you look for somewhere else to live." Just like that. I stood there like, "What?" And he continued, saying that if I was going to settle for a mediocre education at a community college, then I could do it on my own, that they weren't going to keep supporting someone who clearly didn't value the opportunities they'd been given. I was 19 years old, basically no savings because I'd never worked. My parents always said my job was to study. Irony of fate. And suddenly, I was packing what I could carry in 2 suitcases, while my mother watched me from the hallway, with her arms crossed, saying absolutely nothing. The only person from my family who showed any humanity was my Aunt Lydia, my mother's younger sister, and like the black sheep of the family, because she'd decided to be an artist instead of marrying money. Lydia showed up that night. I don't know how she found out, and she helped me pack and took me to a cheap motel where she paid for the first week. She hugged me and said, "You're going to be okay, honey. You'll see." But honestly, I didn't believe her at that moment. The next few months were, no exaggeration, the hardest of my life. I got a job at one of those 24-hour diners, doing night shifts that ended at 6 inches the morning, and then I'd go straight to classes at community college. I slept like 4 hours a day, lived in a tiny apartment I shared with 2 girls I barely knew, and basically survived on ramen and coffee. But the thing is, something weird happened that semester. I took an intro chemistry class because I needed to fulfill a science requirement, and the professor, Dr. Collins, an older man with completely white hair and these round glasses like a movie professor, did something no teacher had done before. He saw me. He didn't see me as the disappointing daughter of the Morgans. He didn't see me as a number on a list. He saw me as a person who had potential. And then something happened that literally changed everything. We took the first exam of the semester. An exam about chemical bonds and the periodic table, a pretty basic stuff. And I studied, I'm like crazy for that exam because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't a total failure, you know? And when Dr. Collins returned the exams, I saw that 92% in red at the top of my paper, and something inside me lit up. It sounds dramatic, but it's true. It was the first time in years that I felt I was good at something, that I could achieve something on my own. Dr. Collins asked me to stay after class that day and told me, "Rebecca, you have a gift for this. You know that, right?" And I honestly didn't know. He offered to help me with tutoring, connected me with research opportunities in the college lab, and basically became the mentor I never knew I needed. I completed my associate degree in 2 years while still working at the diner, and my grades were so good that I managed to transfer to a 4-year university with a full scholarship. Those next 2 years were a whirlwind. I completely immersed myself in my work, in my studies, and chemistry became my refuge. There was something comforting about equations, about predictable reactions, about a world where if you followed the rules and did the work, you got consistent results. Not like with people, especially not like with my family. During all that time, my parents didn't contact me even once. Not a text, not a call, nothing. My Aunt Lydia visited me when she could, and kept me updated on what was happening in that big house where I'd grown up. But it was like hearing stories about strangers. You know? Like I was hearing about the lives of other people who had nothing to do with me. When I graduated with my bachelor's degree, only one person from my family was there. Lydia came, with a giant bouquet of flowers and this huge smile, and she cried more than I did when we crossed the stage. My parents didn't show up, obviously. I didn't send them an invitation. And honestly, I don't know if they would have come even if they'd received it. Lydia told me afterwards that my mother had mentioned something about the graduation at one of her tea meetings, like mentioning it casually as if it was an unimportant fact, like, "Oh yes, our daughter is graduating from some university," or something like that. But here's where things get really interesting. Dr. Collins, who had continued being my mentor all this time, recommended me for a research opportunity at Oxford. Oxford, England. Like, the actual Oxford University. I remember perfectly the day I received that acceptance letter. I was in my small apartment, a better one than the first. At least this one had a kitchen that worked decently. And I had to read it like 3 times because I couldn't believe it was real. It was for a master's program in environmental chemistry with the possibility of continuing to a PhD. And it came with full funding. I didn't tell anyone in my family I was going to England. Well, except Lydia, obviously. I simply packed my things, sold what little I had, and got on a plane with 2 suitcases and this strange feeling in my chest that was half terror and half excitement. I was like 24 at that point, I think, and it was the first time I'd left the country. The flight was eternal, and I remember sitting there thinking, what am I doing? Can I really do this? Oxford was. I don't have words to describe what it meant to me. The next few years were intense. I worked in the lab sometimes until midnight, published papers, attended conferences, and little by little I became an expert in soil chemistry and how fertilizers affect the environment. The irony that my father had a fertilizer company wasn't lost on me. Believe me. I completed my master's in 2.5 years and then continued straight to the PhD. During all that time, I only kept in touch with Lydia, who occasionally updated me about my family. Apparently, my parents told people that I was working abroad, like it was something planned, like they'd had something to do with my success. I finished my PhD when I was 30, and honestly, it was one of the proudest days of my life. My Aunt Lydia flew to England for the ceremony, and she cried so much I thought she was going to dehydrate. After that, I got a position as a professor at the University of Cambridge, and the last 7 years have been, I don't know, like stable, I guess. I've published important research on sustainable agriculture. I've advised dozens of students, and I basically built a life that 18 years ago would have seemed impossible when I was being kicked out of my house with 2 suitcases. And that brings me to 2 weeks ago, to this gala that changed everything again. It was a big event, like one of those fancy events with gala dresses and food you can't identify, but that looks pretty on the plate, organized by an important scientific foundation. They'd invited me because I was going to receive an award for my research on ecological fertilizers and their impact on restoring degraded soils. I didn't expect it to be a big deal. You know? I expected to receive a plaque, give a short thank you speech, and return to my normal life. The gala was at this impressive venue in London, all gold and crystal chandeliers, and there were like 300 people there, mostly researchers, academics, and some corporate sponsors. I arrived early, checked in, and was circulating around the room doing that networking thing I hate but is necessary, when I decided to go to the bathroom before the official ceremony started. And there, standing in front of the mirror touching up her lipstick, was my mother. I literally froze in the bathroom entrance. I hadn't seen her in 15 years, since before leaving for England, and she'd aged but was still unmistakably her, with that rigid bearing and that impeccable style. We looked at each other through the mirror, and for a second I thought maybe she didn't recognize me, that maybe I could just get out of there without anything happening. But then she turned slowly and said my name, Rebecca, like it was a question. Like she wasn't sure it was really me. My heart was beating so hard I thought it could be heard throughout the entire bathroom. I said, "Hello, Mother," trying to keep my voice steady, and she just looked at me with that expression I knew so well, that mix of evaluation and judgment. She asked me what I was doing there, and I explained that I was going to receive an award for my research. I expected maybe something, I don't know, some sign of pride or recognition, but she just nodded and said, "I see," and then asked me if I knew that my father was also there, that he was one of the corporate sponsors of the event. I felt like someone had thrown cold water on me. My father was there, in that same building. After 18 years. My mother must have seen something in my face because she quickly added, "Don't worry, Miss Morgan." She couldn't even say honey or daughter. "I don't think he has any intention of talking to you." And then she left the bathroom, leaving me standing there wondering if this was some kind of bizarre nightmare. I returned to the main hall feeling like I was walking underwater. Everything felt slow and surreal. I found my table, which was at the front near the podium, and tried to focus on the superficial conversations with the other researchers sitting there, but my mind was spinning trying to process the fact that my parents were somewhere in that room. I scanned the crowd trying not to be obvious, and finally, I saw them, sitting at a table on the other side of the hall, dressed perfectly as always. Talking with other people like this was just another social event for them. The ceremony began, and there were like 5 or 6 awards before mine. I had trouble concentrating on the speeches and presentations because I kept feeling this strange mix of nervousness and rage, and I don't know what else. And then came the moment to announce the most important award of the night, the one that came with a research grant of $2 million. The presenter, an older man who was the foundation director, started describing the winner's work without saying the name yet, talking about innovative research in sustainable fertilizers and environmental restoration, and something in my stomach started twisting, because I realized he was describing my work. When he finally said, "The award goes to Dr. Rebecca Morgan from the University of Cambridge," I literally thought I was going to vomit or faint or both. $2 million. $2 million. For my research. I stood up on autopilot and walked to the podium while people applauded, and in my peripheral vision I saw my father get up abruptly from his chair and leave the hall. He just left, right when they were calling my name. I went up on stage, shook the presenter's hand, received this heavy crystal award, and gave a speech that I honestly don't remember giving. My words came out, but my mind was elsewhere, processing the fact that my father couldn't even stay seated to see me receive this recognition. After the speech, the presenter casually mentioned that the grant was funded by several corporate sponsors, including Mosaic Fertilizers, and I basically felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The money came from my father's company. My father's company was funding my research. I don't know if he knew when he signed up as a sponsor, if it was coincidence or if he knew and that's why he ran out when they said my name. The rest of the gala was a blur of people congratulating me and me smiling on autopilot while my brain tried to process all this. When the event ended, I went out to the parking area needing fresh air, and there he was. My father, standing next to a black Mercedes, of course, with his phone in his hand but not really using it. We saw each other, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then I approached because after 18 years I deserved at least a conversation, an explanation, something. I asked him directly, "Did you know it was me? Did you know your company was funding my research?" And he looked at me with that hard expression I remembered so well and said yes, that he'd found out a few weeks ago when they reviewed the final list of winners. I asked him why he didn't contact me, why he didn't say anything, and he let out this bitter laugh and said, "What did you want me to say, Rebecca? Congratulations on finally doing something with your life?" After embarrassing us for years? My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice firm. I told him I hadn't asked for his money, that I hadn't asked for anything from him in 18 years, that I'd built my life completely alone after he kicked me out for not being perfect at 19. And he just shook his head and said that I had chosen my path, that if I'd wanted to prove a point by going to England without telling them anything, that if I'd wanted to reject my family, then this was the result, that I shouldn't expect him to celebrate something he considered a rejection of everything he'd tried to give me. I realized in that moment that I was never going to get what I needed from him. There was never going to be an apology. There was never going to be an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. He genuinely believed that he was the victim in this story, that I was the ungrateful daughter who had abandoned him, not the other way around. I told him I was sorry he saw things that way, and that I hoped someday he could feel proud of me, but that I wasn't going to wait for that anymore. And then I left him standing there in the parking lot, and returned to my hotel where I finally allowed myself to cry. During the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about that money, about those $2 million that came partially from my father's company, and I made a decision. I announced publicly, through the university and at a small press conference organized by the foundation, that I was going to donate the entire grant to a scholarship fund that I myself was going to establish, specifically for low-income students who were starting at community colleges. Students like me 18 years ago, who needed someone to believe in them. The news came out in some academic newspapers and in a couple of online articles, and Lydia called me crying, saying she was proud of me and that my decision was perfect. She also told me that my father apparently saw the article and tore up the newspaper in front of my mother, yelling about how I'd turned his charity into a public spectacle. How I'd wasted an opportunity anyone would have killed to have. It didn't register in his head that maybe, for me, using that money to help others who had been rejected and underestimated was worth more than any publication or research advancement I could have achieved. Now, 2 weeks after the gala, I'm still a professor at Cambridge. I'm still doing my research now, funding it through other grants I've applied for, and I'm in the process of establishing the scholarship fund. I've received messages of support from colleagues, from former students, and even from some people who read about my story and identified with it. But my parents still haven't contacted me. I didn't expect them to, honestly. What did surprise me was receiving a letter from my mother 3 days ago. A physical letter, sent to my address in Cambridge. I opened it with my hands shaking a little. I'm not going to lie, but what it said was basically what I expected. Formal paragraphs about how my actions had been reckless, how I'd wasted an important opportunity, how I continued disappointing them even after all these years. There wasn't a single word of pride, not a single mention of my actual achievements, just disappointment. Again. Always. I tore up the letter and threw it in the trash. Not because I got angry, but because finally, really, finally, I realized I didn't need their approval. I'd spent 18 years building a life I was proud of, surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was, contributing to a field I was passionate about. And if they couldn't see that, if they couldn't celebrate it, then that was their loss, not mine. Yesterday, I was in my office at Cambridge, reviewing the first applications for the scholarship fund, reading these stories of students who reminded me so much of myself years ago, and I realized that this was exactly what I was supposed to do. Not to prove something to my parents, not to get revenge or make a point, but because I genuinely believed that everyone deserved the chance to be more than the expectations others placed on them. There's one student in particular, a 20-year-old girl who works nights and studies chemistry at a community college, who wrote in her application about how her family doesn't support her education, how she feels like a failure most of the time, but that there's something about chemistry that makes her feel that maybe, just maybe, she could be something more. I'm going to give her the scholarship, and I'm going to be for her what Dr. Collins was for me, what nobody else was willing to be. I don't know if I'll ever see my parents again. I don't know if there will be some reconciliation or if we'll simply continue being strangers who share DNA and nothing else. What I do know is that I'm okay with either of those outcomes. I've built a chosen family with Lydia, with my colleagues, with my students, with the people who see me for who I really am instead of who I should have been, according to some arbitrary standard. Sometimes I still wake up at night and wonder what my life would have been like if they'd accepted me as I was, if they'd supported me during those difficult years instead of rejecting me. But then I think about everything I've achieved precisely because I had to do it alone, about the strength I developed, about the empathy I now have for others who are going through the same thing. And honestly, I wouldn't change anything. Well, maybe I would have wished to spare myself some pain, but the results, the person I became, I wouldn't change that. Life is weird, you know? Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who reject you most harshly, and the people you barely know end up being the ones who completely change your life. Dr. Collins died 2 years ago, and I went to his funeral in the United States. I met his family, told them how he'd changed my life, and his wife hugged me and told me I'd been one of his favorite students, that he always talked about me with pride. That meant more to me than anything my parents could have said. I guess in the end, it's about that. About finding your people. About building a life that has meaning for you regardless of what others think you should be doing. And about using your pain, your experience, to do something good in the world. To help others who are where you once were. Those $2 million are going to change lives. They're going to give students an opportunity they otherwise never would have had. And that's better than any recognition from my parents could have been. Next week, I have a meeting with the first cohort of fund scholars. There are going to be like 15 students, all with similar stories of family rejection and economic hardship, all working incredibly hard to build something better. I'm going to tell them my story, because I think they need to hear that it's possible, that you can come from a place of total rejection and still build something beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, I'll be for them, that adult who really sees their potential and believes in them when nobody else does.